semester, which is probably somewhat good. A couple of things. Remember this weekend, a number of the school districts, websites, platforms, different things like that had to go through an update. So there were a number of things that were down. All of the assignments that were due on Monday, you have until Friday to turn those in, so don't worry about that. We'll review quickly the French Revolution in terms of what it meant for most of Europe. In a normal year, normal circumstance, we would tie that in real close with the American Revolution, but we talked about how the philosophers, specifically John Locke, his idea of natural rights, tied into the American Revolution as well, but that'll be your focus next year as juniors. So as long as you're cognizant of that idea, you're going to be okay. As I said last week, we're going to take a look at Napoleon and the way that he is able to sort of fill the vacuum of power after the execution of the king and the queen, the execution of Robespierre, and sort of the void that is in France at this time, and then how he's able to consolidate power and basically take over almost all of Europe is going to be important as we move into the Industrial Revolution and years preceding World War I. A lot of animosity left over from the time of Napoleon on both sides will help to fuel these nationalist ideals that will lead to World War I and cause millions of deaths on that continent. So that's sort of what we're looking at as we move forward. On your homepage, go ahead and click on the modules and go ahead and go to module 9, which is this one on Napoleon. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So you're going to click on this page right here. Hey, Gracie. Just a second, let me mark her here. Okay. Okay, so from the week 9 module page, this question had come up last night, but it's very simple, right? With each of these modules, you have to have gone through the previous 8. And so that is simply clicking through the next portion down here, right? So start at a module. If it says it's locked, go to the previous module, start at the beginning, click through next on all of these, and it should open your current module. But this week, we're going to examine the importance of Napoleon's reign in France and how it affects Europe, right? Basically, because it's going to cause political and cultural changes for over 100 years in terms of what he does. So you want to understand how Napoleon comes to power, explain the changes he made in society, French society, but as well as other societies in and around Europe with his Napoleonic codes, things that you still see in France today and other countries of the world. Understand why other countries joined together to end Napoleon's reign and control of Europe, and then know the political significance of the time period in terms of what he does. So go ahead and click here on this, which is Napoleon's rule of France. And we'll talk real quick and reference what we know about the French Revolution with that. Okay, so last week we ran through the French Revolution real quick, which is something that would have been a lot longer in person if we were able to take time to look at that, but meeting once a week, generally you've got sort of the ideal, right? There were a number of people unhappy from the amount of taxes that they are paying to the food shortages, to what they saw was wasteful spending. And you saw that palace, the gold fences, the things like that at Versailles of the king. And that leads to chaos, basically, right? Everything sort of builds up. Once the first shots are fired, it causes chaos and people start to look and examine about what's going to happen. You have basically the top class, the first estate, just leave France and leave, and it creates a vacuum or a void. So remember that the governmental problem of food that we talked about, the money, the wars that the king had fought, were all things that Napoleon sort of grew up in and was part of. In 1800, Napoleon held a what's called a plebiscite to approve a new constitution. It is approved because people wanted strong leadership after the Reign of Terror. Remember Robespierre, right? And the guillotine, the cutting of people's heads off in that guillotine machine. All the power, all the real power in that constitution goes to Napoleon. It kept many of the changes of the revolution that kept the Third Estate happy, right? Supports laws that make central government strong. And basically, there are a set of codes that become known as the Napoleonic codes that change the way France is going to be run as a society from now until the present time, or from them until the present time. It sets up an efficient tax collection and central banking system, something that's more trustworthy, something that's more official, and something that's more equitable to all three estates, first, second, and third. It dismissed corrupt officials and set up what is known as, in France, as lycées. Those are going to be schools, basically, open to males from all three estates, something that wasn't available to Napoleon as he was French, basically, because the French had taken over the island of Corsica. Napoleon signs an agreement with the Pope. Remember that France is still very Catholic. And Napoleon sees himself as Catholic, and his mother does too, as well. And then to raise money, right, because of the money issue, this is where, the Thomas Jefferson's ties to the country of France during the Revolution. Napoleon is going to sell the Louisiana Territory to the United States to basically raise a bunch of money. And so he is going basically one by one through political, through cultural, through social things, and he is making changes to French society that almost all French people are going to adore, right? They're just going to love that. Now, if you click on your next page, these are the Napoleonic codes. These codes are, in essence, still the rule of law and still around in France today, right? This is how progressive they were at the time period. More than 220 years ago. The Napoleonic Code dealt with people, it dealt with property, it dealt with modes of acquiring property, and things of legal nature. So in terms of people, civil rights, marriage, divorce, paternity, adoption. Sets up the groundwork, and all of those things are still around in French society today. In terms of property, distinction of property, the right of common and of habitation, meaning basically if you lived on land, you own the property. Servitudes or manorial services, basically what in terms of ending France is pretty liberal. Or progressive, as one might call it, in terms of being able to provide a haven for former slaves. Modes of acquiring property in terms of successions, right, from family member to next family member, donations during life, and of wills. And then also in the Napoleonic codes, what an arrest is allowed to, the rights of the married, and rights of loans. Basically, right, a civilized society. Napoleon sets up codes that deal with all the things that we come across as a society and as a people. You can go ahead and click on next. Okay, so I'm going to show you a short clip that's going to summarize, right? Basically, this is the Cliff Notes version of what Napoleon does and why it's important. But once Napoleon gets control of France, he is greatly dislikes the British, but he is going to go after as many areas as he can to make France the greatest country since the Roman Empire. And so when he is done, as you can see those 4 areas there, the French Empire is going to include Spain, Austria, Prussia, Italy. Napoleon, and I'll show you here in a picture, is going to control more of Europe, all right, than anybody since the Roman Empire. And so give you an idea here, we looked at, right, what Europe looked like in 1790. So this is Europe basically right at the start of the French Revolution, right? You've got a bunch of monarchies, a bunch of empires. That is what Europe looked like. Now, when Napoleon, all right, takes over, this is what Europe is going to look like. About 19 different countries down to about 7. Right? And this is Napoleon taking over. He's going to take over Spain, this area here. He's going to take over the Austrian Empire. He's going to take over Prussia, and he's going to take over Italy. Prussia is this area here, basically the Confederation of the Rhine. Prussia, Germany, same thing. Italy is going to be this area here. So you can see he is going to take over more of Europe than anybody since the Roman Empire. In March of 1805, he basically crowns himself King of Italy. His only setback during this time period is going to be the Battle of Trafalgar, October of 1805. Outside of the sinking of the Spanish Armada earlier, this is the most famous naval battle in the history of the world, in which basically the battle of the French Navy and the British Navy wipes out the French Navy almost completely. They're able to control that sea between the North Sea, between France and Britain. And it is going to secure Britain as the world's strongest navy for 100 years until the Battle of Midway, when the Americans sink 7 out of 10 or 7 out of 11, I forget, Japanese aircraft in World War II. That is going to be the biggest loss that Napoleon suffers until later. In the Battle of Austerlitz against Austria and Russia, he comes out successful, defeats the Russians in 1807, defeats the Spanish revolt against French rule in 1808. His first wife, Josephine, who he loves dearly, same thing as with Henry, unable to bear children, divorces her, marries the Archduchess of Austria because she can give him children, and it combines the Austrian Empire, right? The Austrian Empire with the French Empire, combining those before, similar to what King Louis wanted to do. He has a son who he, at a young age, basically gives the kingdom of Italy to and names him the King of Rome. He wants to start his own lineage similar to the Roman Empire. In March of 1812, just into the spring and into the summer, he starts his march towards Moscow to add the Russian Empire to his kingdom. Go ahead and click next on your screen and get to here, and we'll talk about how he overcompensates. So Napoleon, slowly by slowly, is taking over all the parts of Europe and placing France as the dominant force in the world. He's going to make mistakes. He gets greedy, similar to what Hitler does during World War II. He tries to attack the British in terms of a naval battle, and that's a mistake because it wipes out almost all of the French Navy. He basically tries to institute a naval blockade of Britain because it is a set of islands from other countries, and other countries basically go around that and don't want to stop dealing with the British, mostly the Portuguese and the Russians. That's what makes him so mad about Russia. He also makes a mistake, the Peninsular War. If you look at, Spain and Portugal, he is going to waste a lot of resources and a lot of manpower in this Peninsular War, in which Spanish peasants basically fight the French as they move through Spain to force Portugal to abide by the blockade. And so he spends so much money and resources and manpower trying to get through Spain to get to Portugal, who are already basically the Spanish, are already unhappy that they are subjects of France. It is a mistake that diminishes his power. And then lastly, as a number of countries do, they have these delusions that they can invade Russia as winter approaches. And if something happens like an early blizzard in October, it basically wipes out the floors. And that's what happens. The invasion of Russia enters Russia to force the Tsar to abide by the blockade because the Russians were sending wheat to Britain. And an early winter blizzard hits and knocks out almost all of Napoleon's people. They starve to death. They start abandoning. It's just chaos. France wanted to stop all the British goods from entering the European continent and stop his empire from sending supplies to Britain. In the Peninsular War, Napoleon wanted to force the Portuguese to abide by the blockade, but his troops had to deal with the guerrilla fighters to get to Portugal, and that's going to be a problem because they are going to, much like the Americans in the Vietnam War in the 60s and 70s, the Spanish guerrilla fighters are going to fight what is seen as an unconventional warfare, extremely, extremely bloody, chopping off of heads, things like that. It's just unbelievable toll on Napoleon and his army. Napoleon invades Russia because the Tsar refuses to stop selling grain to Britain because obviously the Russians need to survive. He invades with 490,000 troops. Russians keep retreating and retreating and retreating after battles and implement basically a scorched earth policy. So as the Russians basically retreat and retreat and retreat and buy time until the winter hits, they burn and destruct everything of value so that Napoleon can't take it. And then the French, due to winter, random attacks, desertion, and starvation, leave Russia with 10,000 soldiers in December of 1812. So remember, France is the most populous country in Europe. In the fight against the other countries during the French Revolution, they had a draft of 800,000 people. They go into Russia with 490,000 people and come out with 10. That's how bad, this was for Napoleon. And basically, he's never going to be the same. All right, go ahead and click on the next page. And as I said, I know this is somewhat of a Cliff Notes overview, but you see the importance of basically returning France to a prominent level in Europe and then overextending himself basically and is going to have to retreat. So this sort of here is a synopsis of what we just went over. And then I'll talk to you about what happens with Napoleon at the end.
1769, in the small island of Corsica, Napoleon Bonaparte was born. His family were members of the Corsican nobility, but their family was not wealthy. Napoleon attended school in the mainland of France. In 1785, he later went on to graduate from a French military academy. He joined the French army, eventually rising to the rank of second lieutenant. In 1789, the French Revolution had begun. and within a period of 3 years, the revolutionaries had overthrown the monarchs. France was declared a French republic. Early in the revolution, Napoleon was on leave from the army and back home in Corsica. It was there that he joined a pro-democracy group called the Jacobins. In 1793, Napoleon and his family were forced to flee Corsica after having a political fallout with the governor. He returned to the mainland of France and returned to the French military. During this period of time, Napoleon befriended a man named Augustin Robespierre, the brother of the infamous Maximilien Robespierre. Maximilien Robespierre was a Jacobin who was instrumental in the Reign of Terror. This was a period of 2 years in France, where members of the bourgeoisie, and really anyone who was suspected of being an enemy of the revolution, was getting executed. During this time, Napoleon rose to the rank of brigadier general. In 1794, Maximilien Robespierre and his brother Augustin were both guillotined. Napoleon was put on house arrest due to past connections with the brothers. The overthrow of the French monarchy birthed fear into the hearts of many European kings and queens. After all, if democracy revealed itself to be better than a monarchy in France, then it might embolden the proletariat classes in other countries. This led France to engage in military conflicts with many other of these European countries. In 1796, Napoleon, with far fewer forces, defeated one of France's greatest rivals, Austria. Within a year, the conflict ended with the Treaty of Camp Formio, which led to France's increase in territory. Since 1795, France had been ruled by a 5-person council called the Directory. After Napoleon defeated the Austrians in 1797, the Directory gave him the offer to invade England. He refused the offer, claiming that the French naval forces couldn't handle the British Royal Navy. Instead, he decided to invade Egypt, so he could eventually cut off the British trade routes to India. At the Battle of the Pyramids in July 1798, Napoleon's forces defeated the Egyptian forces, also known as the Mamluks. Unfortunately for him, the French fleet was burned by the British Royal Navy at the Battle of the Nile in August 1798, and as a result of this, Napoleon's army was stranded. In early 1799, Napoleon decided to invade modern-day Syria, which at the time was owned by the Ottoman Empire. It ended with the failed siege of Acre, which is located in modern-day Israel. Now, at this point, Napoleon was in a sticky situation, but he noticed that back home in France, there was political instability. He made the daring decision to abandon his army in Egypt and to return to France. The Directory had grown unpopular, and in 1799, Napoleon, along with others, staged a coup, which became known as the Coup of 18 Brumaire. The 5-member Directory was replaced with a 3-member consulate. A consul is something like a president, so basically they had 3 presidents. Napoleon, however, became the first consul, meaning that it was at this point that Napoleon was the most powerful political figure in all of France. In June of 1800, Napoleon once again defeated the Austrians at the Battle of Marengo. This victory helped secure his position as the first consul. In 1802, the British signed the Treaty of Amiens with France. This led to a period of peace between the two countries for about a year. Napoleon realized that France had gone through many revolutions and much political turmoil in the past century. He decided to restore stability to France by centralizing the government. He also instituted reforms in banking and education. He subsidized the arts and sciences and also squashed his beef with the Pope. This was relevant since France was primarily Catholic. Perhaps his most important contribution during this time was the Napoleonic Code. The Napoleonic Code was a set of laws that clearly laid out what was legal and illegal with regards to property, individual rights, colonial affairs, and family. In 1802, he made a major move to consolidate his power. A constitutional amendment was passed that made Napoleon first consul for life. Fast forward 2 years later, and Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of France. The period of time between 1803 to 1850 is marked by the Napoleonic Wars. You can probably guess why it's called that. In 1803, mainly in order to raise money for future wars, Napoleon famously sold his French territory in North America to U.S. President Thomas Jefferson for a grand total of $15 million, in what's now known as the Louisiana Purchase. In October of 1805, the British Royal Navy again destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of Trafalgar. 2 months later, however, Napoleon achieved what many consider to be his greatest victory at the Battle of Austerlitz, also known as the Battle of Three Emperors. Napoleon managed to defeat the much larger forces of the Russians, the Austrians, and also the Holy Roman Empire. Napoleon defeated the Holy Roman Empire so badly that it dissolved and turned into the Confederation of the Rhine. These were smaller states located in modern-day Germany that had to provide troops and supplies to Napoleon for his future conquests. This region also served as a buffer from two of France's greatest enemies to the east, the Austrians and the Prussians. Napoleon had been screwed over by the British on several occasions, and he knew from a very young age that a direct confrontation with the British Royal Navy would surely lead to defeat. Napoleon decided that it was time for a new tactic, so he devised the Continental System. This was a large-scale economic attack on the British. Basically, allies of France, and even those that were neutral in the British-French conflict, were not to trade with the British. In 1807, Napoleon dealt a severe blow to the Russians at Friedland, Prussia. It was so bad that the Russian monarch Alexander I was forced to sign a peace agreement called the Treaty of Tilsit. In 1809, Napoleon defeated the Austrians again at the Battle of Wagram. Once again, he increased the size of the French Empire. Now let's discuss the downfall of Napoleon. In case you forgot, Napoleon instituted the Continental System in order to put economic pressure on the British. The Continental System forbid French allies and even neutrals from trading with the British. In 1810, the Russians pulled out of the Continental System. This enraged Napoleon, and in the summer of 1812, he decided to invade Russia. Many believe this decision was the beginning of the end for the emperor. Every time the French got to the city, it was already evacuated. Not only that, but they would set fires across the cities to burn the resources within that city. This tactic is known as a scorched earth policy. The French were forced to dive deeper and deeper into the harsh, cold Russian lands, but they were not prepared for such a long campaign. In September of 1812, the French engaged the British in the Battle of Borodino, in which both sides suffered great casualties. Eventually, Napoleon marched on the Russian capital, Moscow, but to his dismay, the Russians had already evacuated their own city. Napoleon waited for a whole month for the Russians to surrender, but they didn't. He realized he didn't have the resources to withstand the deadly Russian winter, so he began to retreat from Moscow on a horrible journey. The French had around 600,000 troops at the beginning of this terrible trek, but by the end of this journey, only 100,000 had survived. While Napoleon was suffering defeat at the hands of the Russians, the Spanish, Portuguese, and British teamed up to drive French forces out of the Iberian Peninsula. In 1813, in the Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of Nations, Prussian, Swedish, Austrian, and Russian forces teamed up to defeat Napoleon. He was forced to retreat to France, and in March 1814, this coalition of forces captured the capital of France, Paris. In April 1814, Napoleon was forced to abdicate the throne. The Treaty of Fontainebleau was signed between Napoleon and members of Austria, Russia, and Prussia, and it ended the war and required Napoleon to be exiled to the small island Elba. He tried to make a small comeback a year later. He escaped the island and returned to the mainland of France with over 1,000 supporters. He returned to Paris, and the monarch, King Louis XVIII, ran. He began what is known as the 100 Days Campaign. He started off by rallying together a small army. He planned on taking out each of his foes one by one, rather than fighting a giant coalition, as he did before. He started off by invading Belgium in July 1815. It just so happened that both the British and Prussians had troops stationed there. Nonetheless, Napoleon was victorious at the Battle of Ligny. His success, however, did not last long. 2 days later, at the Battle of Waterloo, the British and Prussians destroyed his army. Once again, Napoleon was forced to give up his power. This time, he was exiled to the British-controlled island, St. Helena. He remained there for 5 years, and he eventually died from health issues. He's encrypted in a tomb in Paris. Although Napoleon identified as a child of the Enlightenment, he did several things that contradicted Enlightenment values. He reestablished slavery in Haiti, which was a French colony during his reign. During his time as emperor, he reestablished an aristocracy and handed out titles of nobility to friends and followers. And perhaps the most obvious example of hypocrisy, he was a dictator. In 1799, during Napoleon's military campaign in Egypt, a French soldier discovered the Rosetta Stone. This artifact allowed us to discover the meaning behind many Egyptian hieroglyphics. No one understood the meaning of this language for close to 2,000 years. This period of time is incredibly interesting, as it's one of many revolutions that started out with the overthrow of a tyrannical, inept system of government. The masses agreed to overthrow a vicious, inept dictator in favor of a better system, only to end up back in a similar situation. That's all for this video.
So that's a quick synopsis of what we've seen with Napoleon and how he is able to come to power and able to use that to his advantage. Stabilizing France at first, and then France is going to become unstable after that. All right. So here's what you need to do. You can go ahead and click on next, and I'll show you the 2 map exercises you'll do. All right, so basically when Napoleon gets going, all right, and takes over almost all of Europe, that's what Europe is going to look like. So there's 9 identifications there, I believe, that you'll put in. Then the fall of Napoleon, when he overextends himself, and then there's a coalition used to defeat him and force him. You can see what Europe will look like there. We're back up to 19 areas, similar to 1790, where items are separated and put out into different areas. And then lastly, there's a review game for this unit on Napoleon. You can play that as many times as you want. It's very similar to the other ones that we have done before. Right? So you can enter your nickname there. There's 31 questions, and it's open for a little over 9 more days before you have to take, right, the assessment over Napoleon. All right, and you can use your notes and your handouts for that. As I said, because of everything that was closed down for the updates this week, everything that was due is still open until Friday. So if you look at those assignments that we had, the French Revolution worksheet and the map of 1790 along with the test are all still open.